Greetings friends, welcome to the Ruslan Belov channel, and today we'll discuss the situation in Ukraine as of November 29, 2025. A significant number of critically important events occurred today, so let's begin our analysis. We start our coverage with the line of contact, beginning with the Zaporožje sector, where substantial and noteworthy developments are unfolding. Interesting reports emerge from the western Zaporožje direction, where drone operators from the 7th Sky Group continue conducting strikes against Ukrainian armed forces positions stretching from Stepnogorsk all the way to Grigorovka. Additionally, information indicates today that Stepnogorsk has now been completely cleared by Russian armed forces units. At present, we're not making map corrections yet, awaiting additional information and possibly geolocations that could confirm the presence of Russian units on the northern outskirts. However, there's a high probability that Stepnogorsk is already history, and the town of Stepnogorsk likely lies far behind the shoulders and backs of Russian units, which are currently actively advancing further northward in the area of Primorsky settlement, and further along the M18 highway toward the settlements of Vasilevka and Grigorovka. Substantial amounts of important news also arrive from Gulyaypole settlement territory. Today, more information is being published regarding the breakthrough of Ukrainian armed forces defenses in the Chervone and Zeleny High area. Additional information emerges about the actions of the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian armed forces and defensive failures. Furthermore, increasingly more publications can be found online dedicated to combat operations already occurring within Gulyaypole territory itself. Sources report that fighting will soon shift to the city's central areas in the very near future. Critical updates also come from the Pokrovsk front sector. Primary actions and events today are unfolding slightly northward, in the area of Belitske, Dobropilya settlements, and so forth. Today, several pro-Russian analysts and mapping services report that Russian armed forces have fully restored control over Zatishne settlement, which came under Ukrainian armed forces control during counterstrikes between August and October 2025. Today, the Russian army is actively advancing westward and approaching the southern outskirts of Belitske settlement. Furthermore, increasingly more various video materials are arriving specifically from this direction. These are territories around Rodinsky and Belitske settlements. In these recordings, we observe substantial amounts of destroyed Ukrainian armed forces equipment on approaches to both Belitske and Rodinsky. We see these settlements gradually being erased from the face of the earth, and combat operations are progressively transitioning beyond the boundaries of the Pokrovsk and Mironohrad agglomeration. Information also arrives that Russian armed forces units managed to enter the southern part of Sofiivka settlement and establish positions in the northeastern section of this same settlement. This is how the map was corrected over the past day. This is how the map appeared on November 28, 2025. And today adjustments are already being made, according to which the Russian army is actively advancing through this settlement's territory. Possibly in the very near future, Ukrainian armed forces will be forced to retreat either toward Toretsk or further northeast toward Torska and Krasny Kut settlements. Next, we move to the Kostyantynivka sector. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources publish this video, and in these recordings, we can observe a series of FPV drone strikes on Russian armed forces positions in the southern and southeastern parts of Kostyantynivka settlement. A large number of episodes from this video material were recorded in the railcar depot area. These recordings confirm that the Russian army is gradually continuing to improve its positions in the southern and southeastern parts of Kostyantynivka. I remind you that according to recent reports, the Russian army is actively advancing through the city, attempting to push Ukrainian formations beyond this settlement's boundaries. Further, we move to the Lyman front sector. Here, primary combat operations over the departing day are unfolding in the Borova settlement area. Various pro-Russian analysts report this. Maps in this sector are beginning to change very rapidly. This is how the map appeared back on November 27, 2025. This is precisely the moment when the Russian army, after brief regrouping, transitioned to offensive operations toward Borova settlement from the southeast and northeast. And this is how the map has been changing over the past several days. Currently, fierce battles are raging for Borova, but according to most experts and various analysts, initiative rests entirely in the Russian army's hands. In the near future, the Ukrainian army may retreat toward Brusivka and also Stary Caravan. Today, substantial amounts of important news also arrive from Borova settlement territory and from the Borova direction. This is how the map was corrected over the past day. Today, Ukrainian sources publish video material in which we can observe FPV drone strikes on Russian armed forces positions located around Borova settlement's perimeter. Strikes were conducted against Russian units in this strongpoints area. This video material confirms that the Russian army, as a result of offensive operations, managed to breach Ukrainian armed forces' defenses and establish positions in this sector. And this, as you can see, is a network of strongpoints positioned around Borova's perimeter. Apparently, in the near future, the Russian army will be consolidating and improving its positions with the goal of creating a certain semi-encirclement of Borova settlement from the northeast. In the near future, high-intensity battles for strongpoints in this sector should be expected. And if Russian units manage to establish positions in this direction, we can state the beginning of combat operations for Borova settlement itself. In the event that the Ukrainian army is pushed out from Borova's side, we can state that in the coming days, weeks, 2 to 3 weeks following these events, the entire central Kupiansk direction, and more precisely, all settlements located east of the Oskil River, will transfer to Russian armed forces control. From the Kupiansk sector and the northeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast, no large amount of important news arrived over the departing day. Since early this morning, information reaches us from Black Sea territory. Various footage, various images arrive. Somewhat later, approximately at 2 p.m. local time, this video was published. And in these recordings, we observe Ukrainian unmanned boats conducting strikes against vessels that are still located in Turkish territorial waters. Sources report that these vessels, 2 ships, were damaged in total. These 2 ships, according to various sources, possibly belong to the Russian Federation's Shadow Fleet. They were completely empty, moving toward Novorossiysk, possibly in order to refuel with oil and subsequently proceed in some direction toward India or in some other direction. But these strikes were conducted, and Ukrainian sources are publishing these recordings today. For now, apparently, as of when I was preparing this video, no official statement had been published from Ukraine's side, from the main intelligence directorate, or any other agency. But overall, the situation is maximally critical. This is yet another escalation, and the matter here isn't only that strikes were conducted against Shadow Fleet vessels. Strikes were conducted against peaceful vessels, civilian ships, commercial vessels. And this, naturally, could lead to full-scale massive escalation of conflict across Black Sea territory. The Russian Federation might possibly attempt once again to halt any flow, any trade with Odessa Oblast, with Odessa ports and ports of Odessa Oblast. Now let's turn our attention to political developments, where Ukraine is experiencing a major political upheaval. The resignation of Andriy Yermak, the closest associate of the Kiev regime's leader. This resignation became the culmination of events that began back in the summer and has direct connections to the White House administration, predicting significant problems for Volodymyr Zelensky personally and the system he constructed. Recent events in Kyiv became possible thanks to the coordinated and effective work of the anti-corruption apparatus. Specifically, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau reached first the wallet of Zelensky, a certain Mindich, and then the co-ruler of Ukraine, Yermak himself. The creation of an anti-corruption apparatus independent from Ukrainian authorities was one of the conditions for supporting the Kiev regime by the United States after the 2014 coup d'état. This autonomous structure was established under Petro Poroshenko between 2015 to 2019. It included NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the investigative body, SAP, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, the oversight body, NAPC, National Agency for Corruption Prevention, preventive work with potential corruptors, and HACC, High Anti-Corruption Court, created in April 2019. There's also the State Bureau of Investigation, created in 2018, which should investigate corruption among high-ranking officials. However, this bureau has no connection to the American-created structure on Ukraine, since its creation was planned back under Yanukovych in 2012. And it's very telling that this agency doesn't feature at all in the current crisis. Nobody ever particularly concealed that this apparatus was created to control Ukrainian authorities from Washington's side. Political repressions aren't fashionable, but grabbing any local official for exceptionally clean hands, you can't go wrong there. The key word turned out to be any. The very first NABU head, Artem Sitnik, was judicially recognized as a corruptioner and led the anti-corruption agency in that capacity for several years. They simply couldn't remove him. By law, the NABU head was absolutely independent from everyone. They went a roundabout way, cancelled the presidential decree on his appointment through a constitutional court decision, then changed the legislation. Ukrainian authorities quickly found the path to the heart, liver, spleen, and other organs of the apparatus leadership. And factually, it worked for a long time in the interests of Ukrainian power, rather than overseas clients. The subordinates matched their bosses. The typical work manner of NABU detectives was opening corruption cases, then losing them on the way to court for modest compensation. One known case involved 2 cases actually being lost, folders simply left at a bus stop. If cases reached court, they amazed experienced judges with their surprising helplessness. Bringing a case to logical completion was only possible with a phone call. Otherwise, the apparatus didn't work. And a completely anecdotal case occurred in March 2017 when NABU Special Forces attempted to detain the State Fiscal Service Chairman, Roman Nasirov, who was receiving treatment at the nomenclature hospital, Feofania. Detaining the official failed. The security guard didn't let them in. The situation changed after the start of the special military operation. Last year, reports from Kiev indicated that NABU went off the rails, entering literally everywhere, compiling protocols and bringing them to court, not taking bribes. Work quality didn't change, but courts almost all accept. They have budget fulfillment plans. Interestingly, enterprises belonging to Ukraine's richest man, Rinat Akhmetov, were avoided by the Bureau. He has very good relations with both the presidential office and foreign partners. Well, naturally, he's one of the main war sponsors starting from 2014. That is, at that stage in relations between the presidential and anti-corruption structures, everything was in order. And this everything changed this summer. On July 22nd, the Verkhovna Rada re-subordinated NABU and SAP to Ukraine's Prosecutor General. The plan was obvious: legitimize the actual situation where the anti-corruption apparatus was subordinate to the presidential office. As part of concentrating power in the country in Zelensky and Yermak's hands. However, by this time, the United States was no longer willing to forgive such attacks on their domains. First of all, the US had long been irritated by Yermak, who concentrated too much power in his hands, and generally by Ukrainian leadership, which learned to skillfully manipulate their Western masters. The West was also concerned about the scale of Ukrainian corruption, which called into question further provision of military assistance to Ukraine. Trump himself needed an instrument for pressuring Zelensky-Yermak for concluding a deal with Russia, and Yermak kindly provided it. Finally, it's simply not his rank. The US didn't create NABU for Yermak to play with it. At this stage, something must have occurred within the US itself. After all, both the anti-corruption structure and civil society structures in Ukraine were designed for Democrats, not Republicans. But as a result, all this began working for Trump. Democrats must now be in shock. Their corruption agencies are working against their own protégés. On July 23rd, mass protests began, called several days later the Cardboard Maidan. Slogans were economically written on cardboard. Grant organizations acted as organizers, and the main contingent of participants was pre-draft age youth. Any other Maidan would have been dispersed in 5 minutes by mobilization officers. And here, Zelensky showed that compared to Poroshenko, he's a weakling. Poroshenko allowed himself simply to ignore the Miko Maidan anti-corruption protests in the presidential administration at the turn of 2017-18, led by Mikhail Saakashvili. In fairness, international pressure on Poroshenko was much weaker. But Zelensky couldn't ignore it. On July 31st, the Rada urgently, deputies had already dispersed for vacation, returned NABU's independence. This was a political catastrophe. Zelensky showed he could be intimidated and forced to make concessions. From this moment, the countdown timer started. NABU and SAP went wild after this. Operation Midas was begun back in 2024, but it was routine compromising material collection on everyone in general, which special services engage in just in case. 99% of this material never gets realized. But after summer events, having received motivation, NABU and SAP began digging seriously. On November 10th, searches were conducted at Timur Mindich's residence. Co-owner of Kvartal 95 studio, considered Zelensky's wallet. Mindich himself fled Ukraine several hours before the searches began. Already on November 11th, a HACC session occurred, at which facts of Mindich's criminal activity were announced through influence on Energy Minister Herman Halushchenko and Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, currently NSDC Secretary and at negotiations in the US. Recordings also featured a voice resembling Yermak's. The case was processed in NABU's best traditions, sloppily. They only managed to establish that Mindich and his accomplice, Oleksandr Tsukaman, were indeed spinning some schemes around Energoatom. The investigation didn't even manage to establish whether any damage was inflicted on the state. But here a second political catastrophe occurred. Zelensky got scared again, floated, surrendered his associates, extremely unpretentiously, declared he didn't know about their activities, began government reshuffles. The political crisis could no longer be stopped. Yermak created political justification for himself, declaring that Ukraine wouldn't agree to peace treaty conditions requiring territorial concessions. On the morning of November 28th, NABU and SAP conducted searches at Yermak's residence, which he himself acknowledged, then wrote a resignation statement, which Zelensky announced. The now former presidential office head, specifically for Trump's information, gave a tearful interview to the American president's favorite newspaper. "I was disgraced and my dignity wasn't protected, despite being in Kiev since February 24, 2022. Therefore, I don't want to create problems for Zelensky. I'm going to the front." Here we must understand that Yermak's resignation factually means dismantling Zelensky's regime, which in recent years represented a duumvirate where manual country management was concentrated in the presidential office head. Currently, the possibility of appointing Premier Yulia Sviridenko to the presidential office head position is being discussed, through whom Yermak could continue managing the country. He won't go to the front, of course, but such a decision can hardly be considered effective. After a short time, a number of unofficial management channels will simply be blocked. Zelensky's fate is predetermined. The question is exclusively in what manner and when his nullification will be formalized. However, surprises are still possible. Let's not forget that European and British elites stand behind the Kiev regime's leader, who are playing against Trump, and quite effectively at that. That concludes everything, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, leave your likes, and all the best to you.